Really? Where? Good. Just checking. Good evening, everybody. So, first of all, I just want to say thank you for coming. I mean, train strikes and snow and ice and everything in between, and you're here, so that's fantastic. I'm going to just go through a few things, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. But my first thing is to say good evening to you all, and I want to start by plagiarizing John F. Kennedy. Why not? He said, remember, I'm plagiarizing, and I'm also changing it. He said, we choose to search for alternatives to trophy hunting, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. That challenge is one we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone. So, welcome to this amazing building, the Royal Geographical Society, which has over the years provided an extraordinary platform for great discussions, and that's what I'm hoping we will have. In fact, I'm convinced we will have this evening. And I also want to welcome the people who've joined us from around the world, including my mum, Virginia, who's watching. Hi, Mum. And I want to say a special good evening to our illustrious panel. Now, I should explain that we had hoped to have Her Excellency Professor Judy Wakungu, the former Environment Minister from Kenya and now Kenya's Ambassador to France, and also Yvonne Igero, the Secretary General of CITES, but a combination of United Nations business, whatever that is, and technology have meant that that's not possible, but we have a great panel, a great panel. I also just want to, because these things don't get said enough, I want to say a very good evening and a thank you to our sponsor, Nucleus, and its founder, Jamie Kershid, who's with us tonight, and two members of his team, Oliver and... Somebody help me out? Oliver and Amber. Oh, you knew I'd get it. So it's sponsored by Nucleus, and I'll just tell you, Nucleus is a fintech group that acquires, builds, and scales blockchain and digital financial services businesses. The portfolio serves B2B and institutional clients with the aim of disrupting the banking and investment industry for the better. Nucleus provides free same-day cross-border payments for NGOs and charities when sending funds to remote areas for aid and humanitarian support. And in Jamie's words, they're thrilled to be sponsoring Born Free this evening and our global wildlife work. So thank you to Nucleus. And the event is also supported by the Humane Society International, the Harry Hotel, and the Gore Hotel. Now, thank you. Thank you. Now, as I said, we're blessed with a wealth of experience, and I will be introducing our panelists individually in due course. But firstly, just allow me a minute or two to set the scene. To begin with, let me be really clear. Tonight is not about walking the well-worn and entrenched path, which means that those in favor of trophy hunting simply argue their corner, and those against do exactly the same. In my view, this has become a redundant process. It's futile. It is not progressive. So tonight is also not about the following. It's not about poaching. Poaching is an illegal activity which we should all seek to eliminate. It's not about subsistence hunting in countries where that's legal. And it's not about canned hunting, which those both in support and against trophy hunting reject out of hand. Tonight is about envisioning what a post-trophy hunting landscape might look like. Tonight is about trophy hunting and what might replace it. Could it be that a growing number of trophy hunting concessions could become protected areas? And if so, how is that going to be paid for? Could innovative finance generate long-term sustainable funding for conservation, landscape protection, and human development objectives that so many of us share? What role might carbon credits play? And what about micro businesses for local communities, perhaps related to non-timber forest products? Could specialized wildlife tourism, low impact, high yield, based perhaps on the mountain gorilla tourism model that has been so successful in Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC, be one of the answers? To be sure, it is unlikely that there is one strategy that will deliver the outcomes we seek. I, for one, am in listening mode. But perhaps, just perhaps, if we are brave and courageous and committed, we can be so much better than where we are now. Delivering for people, delivering for conservation, delivering for nature, biodiversity, and ecosystems. Now, in conclusion, let me explain what the evening looks like. Each of our guest speakers have about 5 or 6 minutes, 5 or 6, Timothy, don't worry, 5 or 6 minutes to introduce themselves and share their experience, the reason why they are preeminent in their field, and why we are so fortunate to have them with us here tonight. Then there will be a discussion. I have presented the speakers already with 3 talking points in advance. They've had time to think about their responses, and I hope that that 40-minute discussion, not a debate, a discussion, will be illuminating. And finally, I will ask you, our in-person audience, to ask questions. Please let these be genuine questions, not statements. This is not a soapbox. We'll have about 20 minutes for that, and then I will close by trying to bring together some of the strands that we've heard about this evening. And may I also ask you to remember the title of this event. It is Beyond Trophy Hunting. So I will, with respect, and if I sense that we're being drawn back into that circular argument, pro and anti, I will not accept those points. And so now, without further ado, can I please invite our first panelist to the podium. He is Timothy Pirri. Here's a little bit about Timothy. Timothy is the Executive Director of Mizo EcoCare in Zambia. An environmental educator and activist based in Lusaka, Zambia, Timothy Pirri is co-founder and executive director of Mizo EcoCare, an environmental conservation NGO. After teaching biology and geography at secondary school, Mr. Pirri lectured in ecology for environmental education at the University of Zambia. A firm believer in values-based solutions to environmental problems, he currently sits on the boards for the Zambia Alliance for Agroecology and Biodiversity, an advocacy network of faith, farmer, and civil society organizations committed to fair and sustainable food and agroecology in the country. Caritas Czech Republic in Zambia, a non-profit organization providing global humanitarian aid and development cooperation, and the Global March for Elephants and Rhino, whose mission is to march against extinction and work with indigenous communities to influence governments to stop the poaching of elephants and rhino. So please put your hands together for Timothy Pirri.
Thank you so much, Will. Greetings to all of you. I come from a beautiful country in Southern Africa called Zambia. I invite you to visit it one day. I'll take this opportunity to do some tourism marketing. I'll start with the status quo. This could be any city in Africa. On the left, you have the low-density area representing opulence and a wonderful life. On the right, you have a high-density area, a shanty compound, as we call it, with poverty and hardships. This image represents inequality. That inequality can be transferred to this landscape. In the middle, you have the national park. The next layer is the game management area, which is a buffer zone for the national park. You have communities that live there and interact with wildlife. On the outside, you have the customary open area. On the outside, in the customary open area and the GMA, you have poverty, you have food insecurity, you have lack of nutrition. So the question is, what exactly can we do to help these local communities that are in the customary open area and the GMA to improve their lives, remove food insecurity, increase their financial capacity, regenerate this ecosystem on the outside? And once this ecosystem is regenerated, we know it will have a cascading effect into regeneration of the GMA, and that will cascade into regeneration of the national park. The opposite, degradation in the customary open area, also leads to degradation in the GMA and degradation in the national park. If there is degradation in the GMA, which is where hunting often happens, it means now you have to bait wildlife from the inside to come out. What I'm offering are what I call ethical conservation tools. There are 4 of them. Introduction of agroecology, which leads to soil credits, which leads to biodiversity credits, and the last one is community-owned, non-consumptive tourism enterprises. I refer to agroecology as the mainstay conservation tool because it's probably the best ally that conservation has, and I'll explain why. Agroecology is a practice, it's a science, and it's a social movement that's growing in Africa. It promotes the use of indigenous seeds and heritage seeds. So that takes away the need to buy seeds or receive seeds from the government. So that's a reduction in cost already. It promotes the use of organic manure. So that means you take out the use of artificial fertilizers that are again expensive and have to be supplied by government. It promotes the use of eco-friendly pesticides. In fact, the seeds we are talking about, the indigenous seeds and heritage seeds, they are drought resistant. Most of them are drought resistant. Most of them are resistant to pest attacks because they've adapted to the landscape. The benefits of agroecology are in the fact that you have regeneration of the farming ecosystems. This, as I've explained already, has a cascading benefit to the GMA and the national park. You have a reduction in costs for production, which makes farming more profitable. Then it is entirely based on indigenous knowledge systems which borrow from science to enhance themselves. So we are not reinventing the wheel. We're simply going back to our roots to look at the practices that were popular in the past. Agroecology leads to the regeneration of soil. That means an increase in the organic matter in the soil. That means more humus. That means more microorganisms. So the question is, if we know that there is regeneration of soil, if we know that there is carbon being sequestered and there's an increase in organic matter and microorganisms, isn't there an opportunity to have soil credits? Can't the farmers be rewarded for this process of regeneration of the soil? The soil being the foundation and the soil being regenerated means reduced flooding, reduced degradation. It also means increase in biodiversity. We're referring to both flora and fauna. If biodiversity does increase, isn't there an opportunity to now have biodiversity credits? We know that the EU rewards farmers for increase in biodiversity on their farms. There is a deliberate effort for farmers to leave a part of their farm for rewilding. Can't the same model be used in Africa? Lastly, I talk about community-owned, non-consumptive tourism enterprises. It's almost as if there is an unwritten rule that local communities in Africa cannot be trusted to run businesses, to own businesses. I wonder why. Because most of these natural resources that are being managed on their behalf and are said to be for their benefit belong to them. So why can't they be trusted to manage these resources? Why can't they have lodges that they own entirely and they employ people to manage and do the accounting for them? Why don't local communities have the right to manage? Why should they just have the right to access and the right to benefit? Why shouldn't they have the right to manage? Why shouldn't they have the right to ownership? Isn't community-based natural resource management all about ownership and the right to manage? So when you look at the ecotourism village, that could be in the customary open area or the GMA, we are now talking about the products of that soil, all that food, all the beverages that can be extracted from the food, all the byproducts from that food, which are now part of the culture of this community being exported to the world. You now invite tourists to come and savor all these in these eco-villages. And the money generated from there goes into the local bank account, not externalized in an account abroad. Their money, they can withdraw it anytime and use it to improve their livelihoods and invest in other businesses, such as owning a lodge in the GMA and owning a lodge in the national park. Yes, we must dare to dream. Why shouldn't they own a lodge? I know people will say, but where will the capital come from? They can invite investors. If they have the right to this land, they can invite investors. They can generate their own money and invest in ecotourism-styled lodges. They don't have to be posh or expensive. Why shouldn't they dream of owning that lodge? Why can't the current lodges offer them shareholding in the existing lodges? Isn't that a possibility? That's also ownership. That bank is important because it's local. Their money, they use it to improve their lives. It doesn't go into a government account, neither does it go to a foreign account. Ethical conservation tools are not just about Africa, and they are not just for Africa. They are tools that I feel we should all get behind because they help us take care of wildlife. They help us regenerate ecosystems. I end with images of our community engagement through various partners in South Africa, in Zambia, where we do outreach to schools, where we promote local foods, donate local heritage seed, and of course, the fact that we do engage with various minds, both for and against trophy hunting on various platforms. An example they're given of COP19. I end the presentation there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Timothy, for what you've provided us with this evening, some essential insights from Zambia. And maybe some of the points that you've raised will be answered by our next speaker, Tom Lalampa. I'm going to introduce Tom. Tom is the Chief Executive of the Northern Rangelands Trust and is a leading African conservationist. As CEO of the Northern Rangelands Trust, he's been instrumental in the design, development, growth of the organization, which now comprises 41 community-owned and run conservancies. The number may have gone up since I've written this, literally, covering nearly 63,000 square kilometers of northern and coastal Kenya. Tom's in-depth knowledge of the challenges attached to pastoral life in northern Kenya and vast knowledge in wildlife conservation has earned him a great deal of respect among the 18 different ethnic groups that he serves. He's been appointed to a number of boards, including the Kenya Wildlife Service, where he's on the Board of Trustees, and the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, where he's a founding chairperson. In September 2013, Tom was awarded the Tusk Conservation Award by the Duke of Cambridge in recognition of his outstanding contribution to northern Kenya's communities and wildlife. His accolades also include the Stanford University Law School's Bright Award for Environmental Sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Lalampa.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Will. I wish London could have been a little bit warmer. I come from Kenya, and in particular, northern Kenya, a very warm part of the country. I come from, born and brought up in northern Kenya, a very strong wild pastoralist background. And coming from a pastoralist background, you could only be right to guess that my parents never went to school. This evening, I want to share a community conservancy model in Kenya, which has really grown. I've been in this organization for the last 18 years, a model that is community-owned, community-led, and community-governed in the community landscapes in Kenya. You might be aware that in Kenya, the legislation when it comes to conservation is a bit progressive. Community engagement has really advanced, and conservation or community conservancy model now in Kenya is becoming a movement that's putting peace and economic development at the forefront of conservation in the country. So this is a landscape where I was born and brought up. This is northern Kenya, a lovely place to visit. And I would like to share with you the stories from the field, really. Nothing scientific here, everything is real, including the numbers.
Livestock and wildlife has always been coexisting in northern Kenya.
In my wildest dreams, I never thought that conservation would be a peace builder. Suddenly, people see animals and wildlife as a catalyst for change in their everyday life.
We're now seeing the first time a community conserving black rhino.
These elephants are not helping me only. These elephants will be helping me and my family. We are helping each other.
The Northern Rangelands Trust is a group of communities that have come together to better their lives through conservation.
The poachers, they are highly skilled, they are highly armed, they are ready always to shoot and kill. So it's a big threat.
Northern Kenya has had challenges with peace and security for many years. Theft, livestock raids, poaching. Retaliations can really spiral, and you get the innocent people suffering at the end of the day. To run such programs in northern Kenya, it requires that you win the trust of the community.
Putting a value on that heroic to the herdsman and his family on an everyday basis. And that's water, it's healthcare, it's employment, it's alternative revenues.
A model that's owned, managed, and driven by the local communities themselves. It's about women, it's about supporting women, financial access.
It's empowering their families, it's empowering the whole community, the whole of the North.
We are seeing for the first time in East Africa, a community is running an elephant sanctuary, taking care of orphaned baby elephants.
The model is really focused around balancing the needs of environment, balancing the needs of wildlife, and balancing the needs and development and the livelihoods of the local communities. That map really just shows the landscape where we cover in terms of programs in supporting these community institutions in the name of conservancies that invest a lot around good governance structures by the local communities. And that strong governance structures helps to drive all other impacts within that landscape. So really, looking at this model, we currently support 43 community conservancies, all communal on the community lands. And they all cover 63,000 square kilometers. We cover both northern Kenya and the coastal part of the country. And we invest a lot with our partners around building governance structures for local communities to be able to run these programs. Just really looking at numbers and real numbers, really. When you look at we invest a lot around leadership training for our local communities. And so when you look at just 1 year, these are leaders that are trained on governance on different aspects. We are focusing around getting women into leadership, very strongly senior leadership, both in the organization and in the council, that provides oversight, which is really key for us. And we invest a lot around also engaging the government. The model has grown to the extent that the national government and the local county governments also now fund those community programs, which is great, really. When you look at peace intervention, because the North is quite fragile, there's a lot of investment around peace building. As Will mentioned, in northern Kenya is occupied by 18 different tribes, different religion, different cultures, and sometimes they conflict over resources, over water, over pasture. And so sometimes we make sure that they coexist. And so having a very strong peace program, peace women ambassadors, getting the elders and the youth together to dialogue so that they're able to live together is really a good thing. We also still have challenges on our parts. We still have bushmeat is now quite high in some of the regions, especially towards the coastal. It's becoming commercial. But the poaching in itself, in the wider, in terms of trophy or in terms of ivory, is really down. But the challenge we have right now is around bushmeat that's getting commercial, and also human-wildlife conflict. Those remain challenges for us right now. But the communities are really cooperating. The model is really focused around supporting livelihoods. We get our women to get involved in bead making. That traditionally, as you saw in the film, they're very good in doing beadworks. And we got now over 1,300 local women who produce beadworks for international market, being sold in Europe, being sold in the US, and they get their money back and they are now really into online marketing and selling. So a lot is really going on the ground, really ensuring there's a lot of investment. Jobs, permanent jobs are being created by these community conservancies. And it's difficult for jobs opportunities to come by in those rural villages, local settlements. But you can see the number of permanent jobs really being created and working very closely. Getting this year alone, we got 880 households to access clean water through desalination, making sure that the communities get clean water for their families. And so really moving. We've progressed now to a Grassland carbon initiative, and we've just seen $14.6 million US getting into these communities. And these communities are managing all this revenue, in terms of livelihoods. And what this carbon revenue does is that it supports wildlife conservation. It supports the restoration and management of the rangelands directly. It's improving livelihoods. A lot of scholarships are being allocated by those local communities. Water projects, tourism facilities are coming up, health projects are coming up, and the communities truly manage that revenue coming from the carbon. Also, just for this year only, we haven't closed the books. Just from tourism alone, a number of them have earned this amount of revenue, just over $370,000 US. We are still to finalize our figures this year, but this is just for this year. And for those who are who have tourism facilities, be they high-end or also self-catering. A lot of investment, thousands and thousands of scholarships being given by these community conservancies. It's about them looking into their communities and identify the most poor families who could not afford their children to school. A lot has been done around health, really, and also microfinance. We are organizing our local women and youth into cooperatives so that they're able to do business. And in the process, they're able to do little savings and pursue own family development. Also really around building empowerment around women, but we are focusing a lot around the health of the rangelands. We come from northern Kenya, we are pastoralist communities, and so we focus communities a lot around the health of the rangelands, so they're able to restore, they're able to manage, and they're able to make sure that they're able to plan because of the climate change. We're all faced by climate change, and so building that resilience by the local communities becomes very important. Same applies to forestry, same applies to marine. But it's about the communities, the elders, the women, and the youth from those local communities really to do that. An interesting one around the coast of Kenya where we work is about mangrove. It's about marine health. And so the communities are getting more organized. Women are along the villages, along the beach, now doing fish farming, octopus farming. They manage their nests. We help them to monitor the coral reefs, and they're able to do auction for octopus sale. And the highest bidder any day, who offers the highest price per kilo, takes the whole day cash. And so that becomes a women initiative along the coastal part of Kenya, while men now are getting into the deep sea. We are helping them to change their fishing gear, so to make them to be able to not to do much destruction, but more importantly, also changing their boat gears so that they're able to go deep sea, fish a little bit, while the women really manage. The same applies to the plastics around the oceans, where women are really engaging and developing different products and that kind of a thing. And then mangrove restoration is a big thing now being led by the villages around the coast. And so when you look at all this tonnage, these are just for recent figures.
Northern Kenya Rangelands Carbon Project is the largest soil carbon project in the world, and it aims to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. It's expected to remove 50 million tons carbon dioxide from the atmosphere over a span of 30 years, and this is equivalent to annual emissions of 10 million cars. For this to be achieved, conservancies have to implement improved rangeland management.
This school is Samburu Community Primary School. The structure of the school is well built, although the challenge is that we have the low enrollment. Some of the factors which has contributed to this is this community are the nomadic pastoralists. They are moving from place to place. They normally move with their peoples.
Overgrazing is really a problem to us, and if encouraged people to keep few animals, it is another headache to us. And as you know, we Rendile people, we only keep animals. We don't have any other source of income. So we are having both human problems and nature problems. And the overgrazing is caused by human, not nature.
I would really like to thank the communities that are participating in the conservancies, the 14 community conservancies under this project.
With a soil carbon project, we anticipate, one, sustainability of community conservancies. Through soil carbon, we are getting a lot of value.
We forwarded through the Board of Management the issue of dormitories, and later we came and get assistance from the community through Nasulu Conservancy, through carbon credits. So we are so much grateful. We've got the donation of 19 beds, double-decker, with the mattresses.
Nimefurahia sana vile ambaye tumeletewa vitanda, itakuwa mali mzuri kwa sababu iko na security, itakuwa na security.
Carbon storage helps in many ways. It helps improve the rangeland health, and by rangeland health we mean that if we have more soil carbons, we have more grasses, we have more livestock, healthy livestock, thriving wildlife, healthy livelihoods for people. And that is what we are seeing today. It's thriving in this area, remote parts of the country. So this conservancy of ours have set a very good example to the rest of pastoral areas. And so I say on behalf of NRT, thank you, community conservancies.
Just really to say that when it comes to wildlife, this year alone, we had an experience of a disappearing lake that had 6 Rothschild giraffes in there. And so the community had this love for this wildlife, and we had to organize a badge to move those 6 giraffes to the main sanctuary across a lake. And just that was because of the passion the communities had. You know, it's very interesting. The model really supports species recovery. We got the most threatened global, antelope in the world with less than 400 individuals left across the world, and none of them is in any zoo. And those individuals are hosted by a Somali community near Somalia border. And they did a breeding sanctuary. They are managing their habitat. And recently they have released 64 of them with collard just to manage their control. And so it's amazing when a local communities take the initiative to protect a global species on their own, and it's not in any other area. When you look at the species like Besa oryx, you know, we did one count in one of the community, just one community. It's got the highest Besa oryx in the whole country, and it's being hosted by local communities. And those numbers of over 800 individuals, it's just amazing in the hands of local communities. For the first time, you know, black rhino is being conserved by local communities in northern Kenya. In 2015, Sarah Community Conservancy introduced just 10 individuals, and currently they have hit 21 with 0 poaching in the hands of communities. When you look at, in the film you saw, because northern Kenya is dry, and so sometimes we get abandoned elephant calves. And the local community said, we are going to take care of them. And they feed them using goat's milk and other formulas. And they're really doing very well in the hands of local communities, and they're working to rewilding them back into the northern Kenya, where they're collected. Down in the coast, also sea turtles management and nesting areas are really being managed in the coastal area. We also work with the farming communities down in Tana River, and there's a lot of human-wildlife conflicts of elephants getting into the farms. And so we're working with the communities to make sure that we protect their farms, because it's a livelihood, just through solar, electrical wires that's sort of solar powered, and just to keep away the elephants so that the community's livelihood can continue, because that's what they depend on, which is just good, really, and also making sure that they have adequate water through solar energy, so they're able to farm, because they're a farming agricultural community, which is just really good for them. And so what the model really does, honestly, is try to balance the needs of the wildlife and environment conservation and community. Wildlife requires spaces, and our protected areas can no longer expand. So the space will always come now from the community lands. And so wildlife to thrive in northern Kenya requires communities. Wildlife requires connectivity and corridors, and those ones must be secured through community. Wildlife requires protection, and that will only be secured through communities. Wildlife requires legislation, and the communities need to speak to the government so that that legislation could be secured. While on the other hand, the communities are also looking at benefits. And so how do we make sure that the communities also benefit from conservation and what they are good at? Communities are more interested in stewardship, in ownership. So how do we build that ownership from the local community so that they feel proud and feel that this wildlife is part of them to the extent of taking care of them? And so we must embed that in our planning. The communities also, on the other part, also requires good governance structures to be able to support their planning. And so we must invest in communities in terms of building their proper, strong community institutions that will support them. So we are really trying to look at how we can do a win-win for both environment, for both people. And we can do that by investing into the health of the rangelands in northern Kenya, so that the elders and the women and the pastoralists take care of the health of the rangelands. And also investing in marine, the health of the marine, also by the marine communities, and lastly also forestry, investing into those areas. But we can only do that if we can put the local communities at the center of it all, and pursuing a conservation of inclusivity as opposed to conservation of exclusion. And that is the model proven, tested, and it's now being modeled across other African countries, including Uganda and other countries. For the first time, we've had the first delegation since independence from Somaliland to come and learn the model from Kenya. Thank you very much.
Wow. So clearly, based on Tom's presentation, it seems possible to deliver significant and diverse benefits, conservation benefits, landscape benefits, economic and human benefits, in a very challenging environment at scale in a country that doesn't have trophy hunting. So is that something that can be replicated elsewhere? Now, penultimately, it's my pleasure to introduce Praveen Maman. I'm going to introduce him, and then I think I'm right in saying there's a short film first, and then you'll come up. So, Praveen is the founder of Volcanoes Safaris. Praveen grew up in Uganda before his family moved to the UK, where he began his career in the British government and the European Union before founding Volcanoes Safaris in 1997. He's at the forefront of reviving ecotourism in post-conflict Uganda and Rwanda. And the Volcanoes has 4 lodges near the threatened gorilla and chimpanzee populations of the Western Rift Valley, which are sensitive to the culture of local communities, the need to use resources in a sustainable way, and that empower those local communities. In 2005, Volcano Safaris became a signatory to the UN Kinshasa Declaration on Saving the Great Apes, and the Volcano Safaris Partnership Trust, a non-profit organization, was set up in 2009 to support community livelihoods and promote the conservation of great apes. Volcano Safaris has been recognized for its work, and Praveen has been described as a visionary conservationist by the Financial Times, no less. In October 2021, Praveen was named winner of the Newsweek Future of Travel Awards. Educated at London and Cambridge University in the UK, Praveen is a trustee of the Seva Mandir UK, and he's on the council of the Congo Basin Forest Partnership, and is on the board of the Eastern African Association. And as I say, now there's a short film, and then we'll hear from Praveen. Thank you.
It's hard to believe it's 25 years of Volcano Safaris. This handful of pictures tell a big story. At heart, this sort of journey that you develop can be quite a solitary journey. And you realize very quickly that you cannot do this on your own. From the beginning, we have tried to make sure that the equation of the great apes and the people around them works in an integrated and flowing way. I believe we have created a pathway that is distinct of how to build small lodges that are warm and welcoming, that are important beacons of hope in difficult areas. I would hope that there is something worthwhile in the spirit of what we have done, how we work, that in the future, those values, those belief systems continue and make a solid contribution to the people of this part of Africa. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. We've known Born Free for many years. They were one of our earliest partners, and they were supporting Congo in the 90s when we set up. And they kindly sent a trip, which Ian Redmond, who is also in the room, who many of you will know, and who is intimately connected with the gorillas since he was a young man and worked for Dian Fossey. So it's an especial pleasure to be here. So perhaps we can just look at different elements of what we have done, what Tom and Timothy have done, and how that interrelates in a way that we can all learn. So behind the schmaltz, what I'm trying to do is summarize our experience in philosophy over the last 25 years. And that's predominantly based on value. Not only value of gorillas, but value of other animals. And that's obviously a central issue of tonight's discussion, isn't it? What is wildlife worth? What are wilderness areas worth? What are they worth in terms of tourism income, income to communities? Both my colleagues from Africa have talked very passionately about that. And also we'll hear later about how they might be worth even more in terms of carbon and their whole benefit to the planet, which sometimes is hard to understand. So how did we get involved in this? Well, my family have been connected to Africa since 1905. And in 1927, a great uncle pitched a tent near the great river Nile and became King George's postmaster among the lions and leopards. So that's something to live up to, isn't it? If a great uncle of yours does that, you don't want to just kind of hang around on the King's Road all your life. So my father too had these dreams, And in 1937, he headed off to East Africa and was technically a civil servant, but most of his life he chased the blue skies of Africa. And at the age of 12, I walked in the Virungas with my father, so my connection to this area is very long and very deeply felt for that reason. And it seemed at the time like it was an idyllic landscape, a lost paradise. In reality, of course, this is 1997, 3 years after the genocide in Rwanda, and it was a war zone. But somehow, there's something about life, isn't it, that can create a giant sense of myopia if you have a connection. Because this meant so much to me, I ignored the 100,000 refugees, I ignored everything, and decided that I would set up tourism. And so the first few years were not entirely easy, but in the end, the world did settle down in the Great Lakes, and we were able to start. So in 1997, I too pitched my own tent next to the Gorillas in the Virungas. And that, of course, had followed what Diane Fossey had done in 1967, when she pitched her tents in the Virungas as well to set up the Karisoke Center. So 25 years of working with gorillas and chimpanzees has made us pioneers of gorilla and chimp tourism. And that's interesting that this story has taught us so much about how national parks work, how to work in post-conflict societies, which is quite challenging and quite difficult in many ways, especially for all of us connected to the Great Lakes. We have lived through huge challenges in our lifetime, but mercifully that has settled down well. But of course, not to be outdone, my own son has pitched his tent in Mogadishu. So there's a family upmanship going on here, where he tries to now work in Somalia and work on the conflict there. So I think that might take him some time. So our 25th anniversary, what does that show us? I think the first thing that's quite clear is that Africa is going to be the most dramatically changing continent in the 21st century. For a long time, Africa has remained somewhat unchanged, hasn't it? It's had not much economic development. It's had very few urban centers. Some people have been skeptical about its future and its development. The populations have been limited. There's been large spaces of wilderness. Well, this, my friends, is changing dramatically. It's the fastest urbanizing continent on the planet. And in the next 20 years, we will see at least 20 cities of 20 million people each. In East Africa, we will see populations double, if not more, in the next 30 to 50 years. So this has obviously huge consequences for the country, for the governments, for the wildlife, for the wilderness areas. And it again brings it back to economic value. If wildlife and wilderness has no economic value, there's no reason for governments to keep those areas. So that will be the big pressure that they will face vis-à-vis other sources of income, such as oil, such as minerals. For our 25th anniversary last month, we invited 25 conservation partners to look together with us at the challenges of the next 25 years in what is called the Albertine Rift. The Albertine Rift, as you know, is the Great Western Rift Valley on the border of Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC. And there's an amazing statistic that's come out tonight from TOM, the Northern Rangelands Trust in northern Kenya, which has been going, of course, since 2004. They manage 63,000 square kilometers. The 4 mountain gorilla parks, that's the park of Mugahinga in Uganda, Bwindi in Uganda, the Park National de Virunga in the DRC, and Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda. That's 4 mountain gorilla parks. The entire habitat of the mountain gorilla species on the planet is 700 square kilometers. So there they are, a conservancy, which is not a formal protected area in the traditional classical sense, is 63,000 square kilometers, and we are dealing with mountain gorillas in 700 square kilometers. And that is the whole issue of the Albertine Rift, which is very, very tiny island forests, island pockets, which are under huge threat. And unless we find solutions, whatever they are, unless we give them economic value, then their future is highly threatened. And this, of course, contrasts with the Congo Basin, where we don't work, but I've been also involved for many years, where you have a giant pool of resources and ecosystems and species, 2 million square kilometers worth of land, which is the future in a way, which has its own challenges, But of course, it'll only have a future if it's not cut down and used for consumption. So all the time we're juggling with human beings using what there is on the planet in a way that sometimes is very questionable. So I'd like to make 3 particular points about conservation, about what I believe. I believe that conservation has to be part of the economic mainstream of a country. It has to pay. Now, this might be unfashionable. It might not be what most of us were brought up feeling. You know, people like Ansel Adams said that, you know, saving wilderness was the highest ideal of a democratic society. And the whole movement of the creation of the national parks at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century tended to put wilderness areas on a pedestal for privileged people, as a playground for people like us, the educated, the people who had the money, the people who could travel. Well, I don't think that is sustainable anymore. I think unless we change the paradigm of these protected parks, and unless they support the communities, as again my colleagues have spoken so eloquently, I don't think these parks will survive. Secondly, I think in the terms of great apes, what it has shown is that this model is one of the most successful in the world today. It's tiny, but very successful. It's tiny, as I said, because we have this small piece of land of, 700 square kilometers. There are less than 1,100 mountain gorillas on the planet. In the 1960s, there were possibly 300. So it's a success story, and a dramatic success story, but a highly precarious one. That's a very tiny gene pool. And Ian, I'm sure, could tell us more about it, that they might disappear at any time, especially if we don't control disease transfer. So tourism, in my opinion, is very important. It connects the gorilla to us, it connects it to the world, it helps pay for their survival, and it helps support communities. Fossey, as you know, was against tourism. I learned recently that when one of the first tourists came, I think he was a Dutch person, she took a gun and shot it over his head. I don't know if that's true, but that's what one of your fellow colleagues said recently. So I think if we had followed the Fossey story of no tourism, I don't think the gorillas would be here today. So that's a matter of debate, but that's what I feel. But too much tourism, of course, will also kill the gorillas. So that's a very important thing, that you have to decide how do you conserve the species, how do you make it have a high commercial value that it can survive. And the third thing, again, is back to communities. If you want the gorillas to survive, then the focus of conservation and tourism has to be the communities. And that's very simple, but very hard to achieve. If the communities don't have a stake, then the gorillas are not going to survive, and other species in Africa, like we've heard in Zambia and Kenya. So the issue will be, how do you keep motivating the communities? Well, in the gorilla model, it's been relatively well thought out. It's $1,500 a pop in Rwanda, $700 a pop in Uganda, a snip if you look at it relative to Rwanda, and 10% of the Rwandese gorilla permit goes to local communities. So that's a direct benefit from a gorilla permit. And then there's all the income, of course, that you get from gorillas. And that's estimated, depending on the year you look at, and COVID has obviously changed some of the statistics, but it's probably about 28 to 30 million that Uganda and Rwanda get from gorilla tourism, just from the permit sales. Now, again, it's a matter of conjecture how much you value the overall tourism economy, and where that goes is an issue. Again, we've heard challenging issues that sometimes it's very easy for us to say, oh, let's do things for communities. But, as Timothy said, why can't communities own things themselves? And that will be another challenge, I think, in this century, that we will have to all grow up and face the reality that people in faraway places, close to important resources, want to own them. How do we create models for that? How do we make that work? So the mountain gorilla, particularly, as I said, in terms of species, in some ways, is easy to control because the landscape is so small. The Lake District is 2,500 square kilometers, Serengeti is 30,000, and Yellowstone 70,000. But will the gorilla habitat survive until 2050? It's very, very hard to tell. I think the gorilla habitat probably will survive because it makes money and because local people benefit, and you see they have schools and better housing. But if you can't translate that model to other species, will they survive? So if you look at the gorilla economy, as I said, the annual revenue is probably 28 million to 30 million just of the permits. And then the gorilla economy as a whole, it's hard to estimate. There might be people who have much cleverer figures than I have. I estimate it roughly to be 5 times that as a contribution to the economy. So that's a major value to the country, to the people. And I hope a lot of it is staying with the people. As always, it'll be a question mark whether that's enough or not. And the other thing that is brought in, which is a remarkable figure if the published figures are true, or the figures that are reported. Since I started building Virunga Lodge in Rwanda in 2002, which we opened in 2004, we were the first international company to build a lodge in Rwanda after the genocide. And a colleague and a friend who is Rwandese called Paul Muvuni built Gorilla's Nest around the same time I did. And so that's almost 20 years ago. The two of us started rather modestly in a rather difficult environment and put whatever we could find in terms of money to start tourism. And gradually over the years, of course, we both spent quite a lot of money, but quite a lot of money to us, which might be a few modest millions. Now, if you add up all the lodges that have turned up in recent years, the estimate that you get is that possibly the capital expenditure of the new lodges just in Rwanda in the last 20 years is said to be close to $100 million. So that is a major sum of money to put into a tiny product, which has about 100 permits a day. But clearly, that is showing you again the cycle and the whole economic supply chain of how this small product is seen to be of high value. So the question I think we'll be asking is that, is this appropriate? How much of this money is going to local people? How much it is going to development? Will this save the gorillas? Will it not? Will tourism in the end become too much and unmanageable? I think these are the issues that will be coming up as the original gold rush, so to speak, finishes. And that's what we'll have to decide as a community, as people who work in that area, as the governments who are responsible, where it's going. So I think in summary, I would say this. The mountain gorilla is a unique model. I don't think it can be replicated to work everywhere because it's such a specific model. It's a very high value, small product sold for a large amount of money. And in its own way, I think it has contributed hugely to support the gorillas and their future. Can it be used elsewhere? I think that's the debate for all of us to have. I think in many areas of the world, it will be possible. But it certainly creates an economic model that already connects in an integrated way conservation to communities and to tourism, and it safeguards the gorillas for the future, providing, and I stress this, providing that it is balanced and doesn't become excessive, and tourism becomes so strong that they overpower the conservation controls. So I think this is where I hope this contributes to this debate of value and how you get value out of gorillas. And unlike some forms of activity, which I don't wish to mention, which might use an animal once, the beauty of the gorilla is that the gorilla has been producing, so to speak, tourism resources now since the early 80s. And we're on to the 3rd or 4th generation of Dian Fossey's gorillas, which Ian would have studied as a young man, that are still there, and they're producing wealth for the future. Thank you very much.
Well, I've never seen a gorilla in the wild. Maybe one day, having seen that. Praveen's raised some questions. Clearly, there's no simple answer. And maybe there is a role in some places for specialized tourism to be part of that post-trophy hunting landscape that we're discussing. So finally, please may I ask my friend and another thought leader in this space, Dr. Ralph Shami, to speak to us. Ralph is Assistant Director at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. He's a financial economist, and he's a co-founder of the Blue-Green Future and Rebalance Earth. Dr. Shami is Assistant Director at the IMF, as I said, where he's currently on sabbatical, working on tackling climate change and biodiversity loss. He's developed a model, which we're going to hear about, I think, for valuing natural capital, including blue and green nature, flora and fauna, and a framework for developing natural capital markets for ecosystem services. He's an expert on fragile, low and middle income states. He's a co-founder of a number of organizations and serves on the advisory boards of the Geneva Macro Labs, the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, and the EU Mediterranean and African Network for Economic Studies. Bright Tide as well, and as well as that, he is a senior financial advisor at Nature Finance and the Task Force on Nature Markets. That's quite a lot. So over to Ralph.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for the Born Free Foundation. Thank you all for braving the cold to come here, and for those watching us on TV. So what I'd like to say is start off by saying I do have good news for you. As you can see from the title of the presentation, I'm talking about the value of living wildlife, not only value intrinsically to themselves, of course, but to our own health and to our economic system and financial system. So that's the case that I'm going to make. Since we're talking about in terms of trophy hunting, I thought I'd focus on one species in particular. This is work of Fabio Berzaghi in Nature Journal, 2019, followed by a recent paper in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, forthcoming. Basically, what Fabio and his colleagues show is that elephants, forest elephants in the Congo Basin, enhance carbon sequestration in the forests between 7 and 14%, depending on their density per square kilometer. How they do so, it turns out that elephants, like us, have taste buds, and they have a preference for eating plants that are low in fiber, that means high in protein, and low in carbon. And what they leave alone are plants that are high in fiber, low in protein, but high in carbon. So high fiber, high carbon plants they don't like. They like to eat plants with low fiber and high protein. It turns out that this result could also be generalized to other herbivores, such as rhinos and gorillas. They too have the taste buds, and they have proclivity for eating plants and vegetation that is low in fiber, high in protein. Therefore, they spare other plants that are high in carbon and highly fibrous. This is also from Fabio and his colleagues' work. Basically, what they show is the way the elephants forage, the way they walk around, they traipse on small vegetation, and they also fertilize the forest themselves. They enhance the carbon sequestration, and what they also found out is forests that have lost their elephants, the forest is unable to capture the same amount of carbon in the forest. So this is from his recent paper. So, you know, they enhance carbon stock through dispersion of seeds, through the fertilization, and through their engineering, the way they walk around and provide more space for old growth to capture more carbon. Now, why is that important? Because it turns out that the whole world now is enamored with, is rightly concerned with fighting climate change, and the way we've defined the fight for climate change through a sufficient statistic, which is carbon reduction, carbon sequestration, carbon dioxide, I should say. So I'm a financial economist. That means the whole world has made commitments. Since it started with the Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Accord, the world made commitments to go carbon zero on net basis, carbon zero, carbon negative, carbon neutral by 2050, predicated on action that were supposed to have been taken at the time of when these commitments were made. But as Greta said, there was a lot of blah, 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 and nothing was done, and suddenly that date moved to 2040. We continued to talk about it, nothing was done. Suddenly the date is 2030, and hopefully we'll do something about it. But what that means is the demand and the urgency for dealing with the climate risk through the carbon dioxide sequestration and reduction is urgent. From a demand point of view, that means the price for carbon, the technology that can do so, has skyrocketed. If today you were to Google on your iPhone, what is the price of carbon dioxide, a ton of carbon dioxide on the European ETS, you'd find that it's over $100 per ton. So that's from the demand side. Where will the supply come from? Well, typically when you think of the supply, people would like to think, well, trees can capture carbon. What the work of Fabio shows is that it's not only about trees, it's about fauna and flora interacting with each other, enhancing the ability of the forest to capture carbon in the forests. I could do the same thing in the oceans, but since we're focusing on land, I'll stick to basically the green side. So what we can do is, since we have the price of carbon, and we can pretty much calculate how much carbon an elephant can capture over her lifetime, and through the fact that she gives birth to babies, some of them survive, don't survive, you can build the population growth model, and then you can calculate what would be the lifetime earnings of a single elephant. And then what you would do, you would calculate the discounted present value of the single elephant, and you would find that when we did this study, this is back in 2019, the price of carbon per ton was $24, and the value of her lifetime earnings in today's money is $1.75 million. As I told you right now, the price of carbon now is $100. So you can imagine how much bigger this number is. Now, this is in present value terms. So what I'm really telling you, if this elephant could speak, she would say the following: I've been saving you by grabbing carbon on your behalf. How about you pay me a salary? The salary would be about $70,000 a year. That's basically what we're saying. Okay, so she is part of the nature's, my colleague in the audience here calls it Earth Tech approach to solving climate change. We have the demand for carbon sequestration. The elephants and rhinos and other big herbivores are part of the solution, part of the supply of the technology that can grab carbon from the atmosphere. So what can we do with this? So you get the valuation. Well, we can build a market around the nature's carbon sequestration of carbon. Let me give you an example. Gabon has done an incredible job of protecting its forests and its elephants. The publicly available data at the time we did the study was 57,000 elephants. If you were to maintain the concentration or the density of elephants per square kilometer, and the optimal density is deemed to be about 0.5 to 1 elephant per square kilometer, and given the space that you have in Gabon, they can grow to about 190,000 elephants. If you were to do so, what you can find out is Gabon would be able, from the sale of the carbon credits of the elephants, to make the value of the carbon that is sequestered by the elephants in Gabon, it's about $33 billion. Imagine. If you would like to know it on flow basis, that's over $900 million a year from the sale of carbon services of the elephants to whom? To a world that has made commitments to go carbon zero, carbon negative, carbon neutral. Now, in order to do so, the first pillar, as I said before, is the science. Science tells us that it's not only about flora, it's about fauna, it's really about biodiversity, interacting, creating that beautiful web of life. The next comes the valuation of basically translating that science into the language of dollars and cents, because unfortunately that is the language that we've chosen for ourselves. Next, if you want to take this to the markets, you need the third pillar, which is what I have for you here, which is the legal framing of our relationship with nature. Who can speak on behalf of nature? Who can sign the contract on behalf of nature? Okay? Once that is resolved, then here's what you can do. On the left-hand side, you have the buyers of the carbon sequestration. Let's, for example, for the sake of this gathering, we say Microsoft is interested in mitigating its carbon production. Okay? It could be a household that wants to mitigate its carbon emissions. It could be an industrial firm. What they would do, they would pay money, And for the work of the elephants, the gorillas, the rhinos, could be, if you like, flora too. And that money would go to look after the animals in perpetuity and to look after the stewards of nature. This would be the local communities and indigenous people in perpetuity. The reason I show it to you like this is work of our colleagues in Rebalance, is to showcase that we can create a transparency and accountability using blockchain technology. And what we're doing here is we're not selling the asset. We are not selling the elephants, neither the rhinos, nor any of the animals. What we're doing here, we're basically paying them for the services that they've been providing for free for a very long time. If we were to do so, notice what happens. Who wins from this transaction? Well, the sellers of carbon certainly, and that would be the governments themselves, because what's happening here, when you sell carbon, you are selling an asset that is acyclical. It has nothing to do with the business cycle, because the cycle of nature is a much longer than a business cycle. It has nothing to do with tourism. It has nothing to do with, God forbid, another COVID outbreak, because the world needs to fight climate change. So you're, in a sense, from a government point of view, you're diversifying your economy, your source of revenue. It enhances the fiscal stance of the government. It makes the accounts of the government look much better. Who else benefits from this? Well, the buyer. If I'm Microsoft or Google and I am buying the carbon or resilience certificate for the work of the elephants in Gabon, for the sake of the example, what do I get out of it? Well, I get to put on my website that I got a carbon credit or a carbon offset. Next, what do I get? I enhance my ESG scores. And because the money is going to look after the elephants in perpetuity and therefore nature, you're creating resilience in nature. What else are you doing? By doing so, you're stabilizing people in their land, you're creating jobs, you're alleviating poverty. You're doing a lot of things, and what that allows you to do is to claim SDGs. SDG 1, 3, 5, 8, 10, 13, 14, 15. That's incredibly valuable to a company because, as we know, in Europe, the regulators now are saying it's not enough for you to do offsets or carbon credits. We need to know what is your impact on biodiversity. That would be one answer to it. So it's incredibly valuable to companies that want to be part of the new narrative, that want to showcase to their consumers, investors, regulators, and potential employees what the great citizens of the new world they want to be. Who else benefits from it? Well, obviously, nature itself, because this is bringing markets with an idea in mind, which is to embed equity in it. We want to bring that money to look after nature in perpetuity by design. We want this money to come in to look after people, the stewards of nature in perpetuity. When we create resilience in nature, and what I'm talking about here, nature is a living and thriving nature, we create resilience in the people. We stabilize people in their land. And by doing so, as I just said, nature wins, local communities win, buyers and sellers win. There are no losers in this new paradigm. This is a paradigm that places nature and people at the core. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to get up and go over there again. I thought that was a fantastic series of presentations, very diverse, very informed, based on real experience. And so now I'm going to move into this section where we're going to discuss the 3 talking points that I have previously sent to the speakers. We're going to do it for about 30 minutes because I still want to make sure we have some time at the end for a few questions. We may drift slightly past 9 o'clock. If you have to go for a non-existent train, then good luck. So I'm going to start by saying we've been discussing what the alternatives to trophy hunting can be, in a sense. What are the opportunities to resource poverty alleviation, local community development, wildlife conservation, habitat protection, And what are the opportunities to do that more effectively? More effectively, more ethically, more humanely. But in particular, what are the barriers and obstacles to implementing those alternatives? How can those be overcome? And I'm just to prompt our conversation here, you know, we've heard about some of those barriers. Land ownership, it's a barrier. The rights, management of land, the lack of buy-in from local communities not incentivized, the lack of buy-in from government, undue influence from external actors, local corruption, lack of a devolved decision-making authority, and then, in a sense, the time taken to deliver those alternatives. People, quite naturally, want results and they want them now. And so, how can we overcome that? So we haven't worked out between us who we're going to start with, but maybe, Praveen, maybe I could start with you. Sorry, but
yes.
You talked about...
Of course, yes,
yeah.
No problem, yes.
Okay, so your thoughts on both the alternatives, but also those barriers. How can we break down those barriers?
I don't know, I hesitate. These are obviously very important questions, but very big questions. Yeah. And I think this is the key question that we all talk about in different ways, the community angle and getting communities involved on an equal basis. And I think Timothy particularly was very eloquent about that. He said, you know, why can't they own things? I think, okay, I would just sum it up and say, I think we all need to change our own mindsets and create the opinion that the community must own the things, and we must find the models to do that. And then if we have the models and we have the mindset, I think we'll overcome the challenges, right? So that means if we need financing from somewhere, it can be found. I mean, we have micro enterprises where women, you know, own certain, we lend microcredit amongst them or whatever, but these are very, very small things. The question is, how do you scale up? How do you make this work? How do you have enough power to go to a bank and say, you will now lend to such people? And maybe people like us have to cover it in some way. So I think it requires a whole, we're all behind on this, I think is my sum up.
And Timothy, do you think that government listens to those community voices? You know, you're very much a community representative. You speak on behalf of those communities in many different fora. In your experience, does government listen? Do they understand? Or are there other voices that are more dominant?
Government does listen to those voices, but the question is, do they act upon those voices? Because there's so many stakeholders. I'll give an example in the agricultural space. You'll have stakeholders from the corporate world who come with resources, and the financial voice will oftentimes carry more weight than the voice of the locals. So at the end of the day, I feel it's a question of offering alternatives that convince government that there are other ways of actually generating finance. Convincing government that it is possible to decentralize the current model, and that in decentralizing this current model, there will be financial gain. Do not hesitate to give control to local communities, because if they're able to generate finance, even government itself will gain in the long run. So that is what needs changing.
Okay, and what you've said, at least partly there, is that money talks.
Indeed.
And so I turn to Ralph, and I think you're talking at a scale that is competitive with those other big stakeholders, with big pharma, with big industry, with big agriculture. So do you think that, how do you get the platform to make sure that the kind of vision that you've set out for us can actually become a reality and not take too long about it, if you see what I mean?
So if you're talking to the government, Government looks at land, looks at as an asset. So you have indigenous population that say, we have ancestral claims to this land, our culture is here. The governments don't see that. There have been many cases in the law where government has, despite the rights of people to their land, they've yanked it and gave it to those who could generate revenue from it. What this model does, it tells indigenous people, local communities, you can retain all of that, retain ownership of it, but you could also benefit from it. It's a coincidence of interests, because what you're doing here, by the way, carbon is just a short game. I mean, it's just to bring people into this idea that a living and thriving nature is valuable beyond its intrinsic value for itself. If it did nothing for us, this is about ecosystem services, ecosystem functions that our society values. It is willing to pay money for it. It just happens to be that the first market that we have right now is carbon. Pretty soon it's going to be biodiversity and other things that are coming. But sticking with the carbon market, what you have to, and by the way, I am in that space. They listen to you very quickly, because if you talk to them about what the scientists say, for example, it will enhance biodiversity, it will have this, you can see their eyes glazing over. The moment you say that translates into so much dollars, they're laser focused. Then the next thing you want to know, what are we going to get out of it? So what this model says to them is, you're going to make a lot of money, but you're going to make a lot of money by leaving the land alone, by looking after it in perpetuity, by looking after nature. When I say land, fauna, and flora in perpetuity. And then for the indigenous people, you say never sell the asset, please. Let me be very clear here. This is not about the sale of the asset at all. In fact, I always go all over the world saying never sell the asset. You're just basically leasing a service. It's like you have an apartment and you're leasing it. You're renting it out, but you retain ownership of it. So we have chosen for ourselves as a race, as a market system, let's say, those that operate in market system, a language of dollars and cents. In this market, you are invisible until you can convert whatever it is into dollars and cents. Suddenly, the system says, oh, you're visible, you're here, you're part of the equation. And this is what you have to understand. You cannot go to the government and proselytize about altruism and all. They'll listen to you, but they can't wait for you to leave in order to award that land to somebody else who's going to make money and give them tax revenue. That's the reality of it. So you need to figure out, how am I going to translate whatever I'm interested in into their language? This paradigm, what it does, it says to the government, you're going to make a lot of money. I mean, imagine for Gabon itself, you're talking about $900 million that can come in from the sale of carbon services of elephants, okay? The government will make money because the money is going to come in, is going to raise the income levels. For the same level of taxes, you're going to have more tax revenue. It's going to diversify your revenue basis. It's going to, and from a stock perspective, once it enters your balance sheet, your net worth changes, correct? Your ratings are going to change, your debt sustainability is going to change, everything will change for you. So you need to have that conversation with the minister, not only of the environment, who's already a convert, but it's the Minister of Finance who needs to look at you and say, you're bringing me something that I care about. This is where we lose the battle. You got the Minister of Environment who's a convert, and the Minister of Finance who doesn't see what's in it for me. You have to make that link. For the communities, you're going to say, I've been in development business for 30 years. You've been lied to repeatedly. We understand you've been promised so much, and the money that has come in has always gone into the coffers of the government, and you've seen nothing of it. What I was showing you, is a blockchain technology, enterprise blockchain, which has no carbon footprint, minimal. The money goes directly your contract is with the indigenous and the local population by design. What Timothy was saying and Tom was saying, and we're all saying, you need to empower the community. The community will be part and parcel. They'll be in charge of designing the contract that fits their culture. Now, why would you want to do that? Because remember what the demand side here wants. They want to show that they're good citizens of the world. So you're matching expectations. The Microsofts of the world want to say, I'm not just offsetting my carbon with all of the backlash, but I'm also being a good citizen of the world. Look what I'm doing. I'm enhancing the welfare. I'm creating resilience in the communities. And you're going to the communities saying, this is your chance to structure that contract that fits your culture. Nature wins because by design, this is made to create an endowment fund that looks after nature in perpetuity.
Indeed. We will probably come to that. Thank you. I just want to go to Tom briefly, Tom. Empowering communities, when they're one small community and one small community and another, it's very hard for those voices to filter up to the highest levels of government. But because you represent 18 indigenous communities across a 63,000 square kilometer landscape, do you feel that you're able to bring those voices to the top table? And if they were combined with the kind of models that Ralph's talked about and the specialized ecotourism and the agricultural side that our other speakers, do you think we can get traction?
The answer is yes, and that's exactly what happened in Kenya currently. First and foremost, we are very strong believers of strong community institutions. In northern Kenya, we realized that we could not influence the national discussion, the national discourse. And so what we did in 2012 is to form a national body of conservancies in Kenya called the Kenya Wildlife Conservancy Association. And so now all the 226 conservancies in Kenya are all under one national body called Kenya Wildlife Conservancy Association. And that really helped us to elevate our voice, our lobbying, to the national level, to the extent that we've been able to influence several legislations in the country, because for us to do conservation at the community level, we need very progressive, very supportive legislation. And so we've been able to do that because we became a big constituent in the country, we became a movement in the country, and we are able to bring the landowners, the local communities on the table to talk with the government. Ideally, what we said is that the conservation organizations in Kenya also form their own forum called Conservation Alliance of Kenya. And the landowners, being local communities and private landowners who are hosting wildlife in their own land, also form a national forum in the name of Kenya Wildlife Conservancy Association. And then we got the government as a wildlife authority. And so we became equals in some extent, complementing each other and negotiating on the table, as opposed to communities being viewed as sort of passive listeners, passive contributors. So that really elevated the voice of the local communities to the national level. You can't believe, during COVID, the national government, through the national treasury, was in a position to support and pay community scouts across the country, which for the first time in history, just because we became a very strong voice, a very strong constituent in the country. And so by coming together, by reorganizing, the communities are hosting this wildlife in their own land, really enabled us to be in that strong bargaining. So really strong community institutions, progressive legislations, durable finance that we are working on now, and land ownership, which we are really pushing to ensure that the local communities get security for their land. Out of the 43 communities we work with, we already have secured land tenure for 12 of those communities in perpetuity. And so they're able to do their planning, conservancy management plans, they're able to run, and we are now investing more into good governance to enable them fly.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to move to, we've actually ranged so broadly across the points that were the talking points that the talking points have, in some respects, been already partly answered. But I guess one of the things I would be interested in knowing is, are communities ready and able to accept the responsibilities that we've talked about. And Tom, you were at pains to point out in your presentation the issue of good governance. Strong, robust, good governance. So I'm going to come straight back to you and say, what does it take to have communities empowered to take that responsibility?
Thanks, Will. I think the weakest point on the communities has always been structures. Within the community, the villages where most of us come from, unless there's very strong structures built, then things are very loose. And so within the community conservancy model that we support, so purely communal on community land, first of all is about sitting those community to form the institution, the structure, registering with the government, have democratically elected boards from those villages, representatives, and ensure that everybody is trained on their structure. The boards are trained on their role, the finance committees are trained, the grazing committees are trained, everybody in the structure is trained. And so once you do that, and they have to pay their taxes to the government, it's not negotiable, and they now bring development partners on board to support them. But the technical development partners like ourselves just really come in to support them with the science, with the funding that they require. But they have to dirty their hands doing it themselves. They must be audited on an annual basis. We have to push for best practices. And so the secretariat that I lead in the NRT, Northern Regional Trust, is to look across that. And so we also bring about social pressure to bear to every community, because for us, one community is neighboring another community and another community is bordering the other. So there are some best practices that they have to keep. And they must know, like in the carbon project, it can only work if they're all working together. And so if, for instance, poaching is happening in this community, the other community will raise a voice because they depend on the same elephants to do tourism at the other end. And so the reality is that every local community needs one another. And they also need protected areas because they border, they do tourism, and they utilize the protected areas, the parks, even for game drives. So it's really about that level of governance, ensuring they have very strong bylaws, including on benefit sharing, for instance, including on board rotations, including on audits, including on board performance governance charters. The managers must be at a certain level, and they have to run their books of account. They employ their own staff. They run themselves as institutions, and they do leases for tourism investors, 30 years, renewable, bargain for whatever bed nights, whatever consumption fee they charge, and we just keep an eye to make sure that there are best practices to everybody. So it's about really good governance that will drive that conservation, will spare that, will secure that space, and will make sure that the benefits, other than just at the communal level, trickle down to the household level. Now we're looking at households receiving an annual amount of money just for their work. But you can still do schools that are communal. You can still do health. You can still do peace. You can still do rangelands. All these that are benefits a larger community. But you have to take it down to the household so that every mother, at the end of the year, at least receives something on a standard basis that knows that this is an income that I can use to put food on the table.
Really feels it at the household level.
And the bottom line at the end of the day is that conservation is about people. Let's never lie about that. Conservation comes back to people. And so if you touch their hearts, you'll influence everything.
All right. So talking about people, I'm not going to be able to go to everyone for every question. I'm going to just go quickly to Ralph. You mentioned to me earlier when we were coming in that your boss, or no, your former boss, because she moved to the European Central Bank, was Christine Lagarde. And I said to you, can we not get Christine Lagarde to find the resources to take, I mean, actually, this is a question I want to put to you and also to Timothy, and do jump in, Praveen, as well. But has this kind of conversation ever taken place at the African Union? Where here we are in the Royal Geographical Society having, I think, an extremely profound discussion about what the future for communities and their interrelationship with wildlife might look like, and we're talking about Africa in particular, but I'm sure it could be extended into other parts of the world, what that might look like, both at a policy level at an accountability level, at an implementary level, and at a financing level. Is this not, should we not just put you all on a plane somewhere, sponsored by Microsoft, and funded by Christine Lagarde, and go and talk to with the African Union to say, does this sit with you all? How does this work? I mean, give me the Christine Lagarde, and then I'm going to go to Timothy for the...
That question should be posed to Madame Lagarde.
Yeah.
But, you know, but let me put it this way. I see no, you know, my mom would always say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Mm-hmm. Implement today, perfect tomorrow. We know the science is telling us, science now is telling us what a living and thriving nature can do for us. This is something you could have pretended you didn't know. But now you know. Now you've seen the light. You cannot walk in darkness. Mm-hmm. Right? So when you approach, by the way, governments do approach us, do ask us questions, and there's quite a bit of interest. Typically, it's how does, you know, there's the information part, which they don't know, and this is also on the community side. I mean, local communities, indigenous people, they know the intrinsic value of their land. You don't have to tell them that. But they may not know about the financial valuation, an option that they have. It's like I'm sitting on a piece of land, I don't know that I can rent it out, keep ownership of it. So part of this work is informing government what they can do, what they can get out of leaving nature alone, protecting it, restoring it, rejuvenating it. Part of it is talking to the indigenous and local communities saying, do you know that you have now, you can avail yourself of these optionalities that you didn't have before? It's also education. Let's not just say about, you know, the African Union, educating our own companies here in our midst, right? Telling them it's not about carbon offsets. It's much more than that. It's about you investing. I'm not talking about philanthropy here. Investing in nature, in a living and thriving nature, where you're not only going to look good and put it on your website and therefore garner the allegiance of your consumers and so forth, but you're going to make money off of it. So I find myself doing this, talking to the buy side, to the sell side, to the communities, and to government officials, saying, this is a new pie. This is new wealth. This is not divvying up of an old pie, which I get more, you get less. This is something that, look, oil-producing countries, let me give you just this. Oil-producing countries sat on a black goo for thousands of years, didn't know what to do with it, until Henry Ford decided to move his car from A to B. And suddenly that black goo, oil, got a price of $100. So you can say, what do we have? Well, you're sitting on something that right now we need because we are fighting climate change. And suddenly it acquires a value. It's as simple as that. And it's a new form of wealth. Now, we have to be very careful because forms of wealth could also be abused. So markets, and I'm sensitive to that because people ask me all the time, markets are not about equity. Markets are about efficiency. We have to bake equity into the markets. We have to say, we're going to bring the markets in, we're going to bring the finance in, but such that they satisfy our interests. And what is our interest? To look after nature in perpetuity, to look after the stewards of nature in perpetuity. And when I say nature, I'm talking about fauna and flora, blue and green, and talk about the stewards of nature in perpetuity, and these are the people. The lives of people and nature are intertwined, last I heard.
Thank you. And Timothy, the reason I wanted to come to you on this was there is a relatively new leader in Zambia. I follow HH. I think everything I read is impressive. I am impressed by this individual, really. I keep liking all his tweets. And we also have new leadership in Kenya. Do you think that perhaps HH could be the kind of champion that can take this into the African environment? And by that I mean all the African countries, through that African Union platform, You know, should we go and see him? Should we go and see President Ruto? Who needs to be seen? Not do we, I'm discounting myself from this conversation. Who needs to be seen? Who needs to be persuaded? Because we've gone from the community level, we've gone from discrete tourism opportunities, we've gone to landscape level community programs, we've gone to a very high level of potential funding, but we need, I would imagine, the political will to make this happen. What would be your words on that?
Definitely. In the case of Zambia, you know, before the regime change, we had some very difficult times. And the new government has come in with hope and promise. And when you specifically look at the manifesto for the government, you will note that they definitely support environmental sustainability. In terms of agriculture, they've shifted policies. For example, we used to have the Farmer Import Supply Program, which emphasized monocropping, which emphasized fertilizers, but they've shifted that to a comprehensive supply program that gives farmers the choice to have various crops. So definitely there is need to consult leadership, but that is not enough. There is also need to consult local communities, because the approach should always be from the bottom going up. So what we need to do is work with local community organizations, indigenous community organizations, and see what type of knowledge we can get there and input into the ideas of technocrats, and then arrive at a solution. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious, forgive me, Praveen, but I'm conscious of time, so what I'm thinking is I may not go to the third question because we've sort of answered a lot. I'll tell you what the question was. It was talking about the voice of rural communities. And we have touched on transparency, we've touched on accountability, effective communications, resource equity, the clear distribution of benefits, both at the community and the household level, as has been pointed out to us, and the need for transparent monitoring and evaluation to demonstrate those positive outcomes, those positive lasting outcomes. So I'd like to, because we have perhaps 15, maybe 20 minutes, and I can't imagine you don't have some questions, but please remember, I'm hoping it's a question and not a long, I'll cut you off if it's a long point, seriously. I've been doing this too long. So can I ask, it'll be a show of hands. I'm going to take Niall down the front, and then Simon. These are people I know. I'm trying not to pick people I know. And then, is it? Yes, Jenny. Jenny, who I know. Oh, and then there's someone I don't know, and there's someone I don't know, and there's some. So I've got 5 questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You gentlemen with the glasses, yep. So we'll start with those. And yes, and Jamie. So we'll start with those 5, and then if we've got time, we'll come to you. And I'll probably only ask one of our panelists, maybe 2, to respond to each question. Let's keep it fairly tight, and we're starting with Niall.
Thank you, Will. Thank you all the panelists for fabulous discussion. My question is one of timescales. Praveen, you discussed the rate of population increase happening in Africa. There's an area of land in Africa the size of France and Spain combined, currently set aside for trophy hunting. In Tanzania alone, 40% of that area is vacant. That is the area of land that is going to be occupied very rapidly by an ever-expanding population. How do we facilitate funds to that enormous estate as rapidly as possible before it is lost to nature forever?
Okay, and I'm just going to check. Did everyone kind of hear the question? You did enough. That's fine. Thanks, Niall. So it's a question, I think, of moving into vacant wildlife space previously occupied by trophy hunting activities not currently used, now vulnerable to other forms of land use which may not be wildlife friendly. I'm going to start with Praveen, if you have any thoughts about that.
Again, I think it's back to the mixture of government and communities, isn't it? But I think one of the areas that this discussion has shown is that countries that have strong civil societies is where you begin to have good action. Kenya is a great example, because Kenya has had stability, obviously, since independence, and it's had transfer of power, it's had elections, so it has built up a very strong civic society. So I think in a country like Kenya, that would be easy. In Tanzania, there is civil society. It's not as advanced. In countries where it doesn't exist, like post-conflict areas, or where it's much weaker, it's harder. But I think the best solutions would come, as Timothy said as well, bottom up. If the community said, look here, this is this land, it's now empty. We need this to be safeguarded. We need it to have populations of animals in it from which we can benefit. I think that's what would bring the biggest change, because otherwise we get all the time in different of our countries. I think the Rangelands Trust, in a way, has managed to break through in a very exceptional way, because governments, of course, own the protected areas. They manage the national parks. They do what they want as they choose to, as they do in any country. But if there's no civil society saying, actually, this is not appropriate, you are not handling this well, they continue doing that. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's all back to advocacy. So if you are involved and other people are involved and people on the ground are involved, that's what will change it quickly. And as you say, these things are often urgent, because if you don't control a piece of land today and it gets run over by people for other sources, then that has a very negative long-term impact and very, very hard to take back again.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go, I think it was Simon next.
Hi, Simon Jones from Helping Rhinos. Firstly, thank you for a very inspiring, informative panel discussion. I think a lot of it rings true for what we know and what we think the future needs to be for conservation. But just thinking about how we move from trophy hunting into something else. So my understanding is that 23% of trophy hunting comes from South Africa, I think second only to Canada in the world. Most of that trophy hunting comes on private-owned land as opposed to already community land. And I think somebody said, money makes the world go round. So how do we take something to those private landowners to convince them that there's an alternative, which they're doing trophy hunting, so they say on the basis of it's the only thing that generates them the revenue. How do we take it to them and stop a government that's actually increasing their trophy hunting quota almost year on year? How do we take some of these ideas today? And I think, in particularly, Ralph, I think your ideas particularly could work in that area. But how do we take it to those myriad of private landowners today?
Yes, yeah, it's actually a very interesting point, because we've spent a lot of time talking about community lands, but we've not talked so much about privately owned lands, where all sorts of activities go on, and that's the business of the landowner and not really the business of anyone else, as long as it's legal. I'll come to Ralph, because I think what we're looking here is at a competitive analysis.
Absolutely. Let me reiterate, this is a purely investment proposition. So when you're proposing the solution that I presented to you, it has to stand up to the trophy hunting. Let me give you something that I've had to deal with, a real-life example. I'm not going to name the country. There's a big developer that wanted to dredge what he called was a swamp. Once, when we looked at the swamp, it turned out to be mangroves. And once we looked at the characteristics of the mangroves through the science, we were able to calculate that that swamp was worth $1 billion. Now you go back to that developer and say, you could dredge that and build a hotel. It's going to cost you money, and how much money are you going to make? If you leave it alone, you're going to make more money, and you're going to look really good. And the decision was not to dredge the swamp. So you have to approach it. So for the private owners, you have to make that proposition. And just to bring in Niall's point into this, the way I would do it is the first thing you got to do for that land is what is it that you have? what kind of vegetation that you have, because if you talk about the carbon market, what kind of how much does it have right now? How much can you grow on it so that you can get the additionality? That's scientific accounting. Then people like me would come in and do the valuation, market valuation of it. Next thing is, because the owner already owns the land, there is no issue of legality here. He or she can speak on behalf of the asset. You can directly take him to the market. This is how you do. These are the 3 steps that you have to do. You do the accounting side, scientific accounting. What is it that you have? How much of it do you have? How much of it can you grow? Because there are 2 things you can get carbon credits for. Additionality. I had this much, I'm now down to here, going back, or I have this much and it's under threat. How much is under threat? You can get the carbon credits for it currently. So you do that. The next thing, you have to do the market valuation to get an idea what is your ask. Then you need to figure out who owns it, who can speak who can write that contract on its behalf of the asset. Then the asset goes from being an asset to being capital. It enters your balance sheet. It changes your net worth. Then you go to the markets, and trust me, there's a huge market out there. You just have to know how to access it. So part of it is educating the owner, the private owner, say, look, you can continue to look like a pariah because you're allowing trophy hunting here, or you can look really, really good by leaving that land alone, and you can make money. How wonderful is that?
Yes.
Just a slight one, because we need to convince the private landowners who have done massive investment by hosting those wildlife in those landscapes. And so I see one big opportunity is really to review the translocation of wildlife in some of these African countries. In terms of process, in terms of legislation, it's so complex to move wildlife from one locality to another. Even in some of the countries that I'm aware of, is that the cost of moving wildlife or translocating wildlife, certain species from one area to another, can take years to get approvals, to get it's just a nightmare. And so, even where I come from, the local community sometimes request, they write letters and say, we would like certain species, we'd like to move them into our locality, because they want to conserve because of historical reasons and many other reasons. But the process is complex. So if we can ever review as countries the legislation processes of moving wildlife from one area, from one private property to another, from one protected area that's getting overly, which is getting to a carrying capacity, to another locality, we've got communities, private properties that are dying to translocate or move this wildlife, and with some level of compensation to the privates or wherever who have been conserving them over the years.
It's a very interesting point indeed. I have been trying to make a few notes, but not keeping up. And I think it was Jenny next.
Yeah. Hi. I'm Jenny Desmond from Liberia Chimpanzee Rescue and Protection, and I want to thank everybody up there. This great conversations. Thank you for all your work. It's amazing, and it's very inspiring. My question is about how Timothy brought up hope and promise. Ralph talked about money talks. Everybody talked about benefits need to go directly into these places. And we talk about dollar amounts, but we know we're in a race against time, right? We can't wait for 10 years or 20 years to build a tourism industry or even to build this concept that Ralph's talking about. How do we integrate some type of what I guess for lack of a better term, down payment system so that people see money right away? So they invest their belief systems into these approaches and strategies. And I think we need to use all of the strategies all at once. I don't think any one of them needs to be left out right now. And in a place like Liberia, where we've had a lot of hope and promise, and a lot of that has been dashed, I think this is really going to be key for people to have a concept of a down payment in order to believe in what you're selling to them today. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to ask Praveen maybe just to comment on this on the basis that you were a risk taker in your early days. You put that tent up and believed that you would one day be able to create a flourishing business, and you did. And now your son's seeking to do that in Mogadishu. yes, how can we encourage people to take a bit of a leap of faith and put in the beginnings of a process? Often, there will be people in the audience who are familiar with this. We're told that you can't remove one activity, in this case, trophy hunting, unless you have a fully funded alternative in place. I'm not familiar with that model in any other environment. If we had said that in relation to renewable energy, we'd still be sitting here waiting for renewable energy, because we say, well, we haven't got a fully funded alternative to oil, gas, and coal, so we're going to continue with oil, gas, and coal. That's not really how the world functions. So how do we manage the risk?
Well, I think risk-taking often comes from naivety and comes from unemployment and romanticism.
And you.
Exactly, and a combination of these things. So that, in a way, is sometimes the issue, isn't it? That if you start doing the books, as you say, in terms of renewable energy, you don't have the solution, so you cannot not do anything. But obviously, if you are a normal business person, you analyze risk to, the nth degree, and then possibly you wouldn't take the risk. If you're not a normal business person like me, then you take the risk, and somehow it came good. But I think a midway solution in that might be that somebody, all these areas that we've talked about, a protected area in Tanzania, there are many parks in Africa that don't have infrastructure, that don't have things happening, where the communities want to do things. I see this in the Congo Basin all the time, where it's so difficult to work there. I think that's, again, where partnerships come into it. So you say, okay, this is a risk. You can't go to the bank in the high street and say, give us $7 million and I'll pay this money back. But following the Ralph model, you say, actually, the reason for doing this is this. It's a much wider earth benefit. Mm-hmm. And if, Ralph's figures are really interesting. It's the sort of thing that, we're all learning about. But there are major parts of the world that do have an intrinsic value. The value of a forest in Rwanda or Uganda is major, isn't it? If it disappears, we will be the poorer for it. So I think there's an element of combining risk with this new way of looking at the value of an ecosystem, the value of a particular elephant, the value of the elephants in Gabon. And maybe this will give us the model, so you don't have to have, risk takers like me trying to do it, who in any case will have limited amounts of money. Mm. This sort of stuff needs major investment.
May I just pick up on this? Because I think it depends who it also depends who you're talking to. You mentioned the forests. I mean, imagine if you lose the forests of the Congo Basin. Yeah, yes. Do we really understand here in this audience what does that mean? That means 200 million people are going to be on the move. That's what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So if I were to pitch that to the authorities you were mentioning, that would be my pitch. Mm-hmm. It's better to invest in the resilience of the forests and get money in return, because this is investment. This is not philanthropy. You create resilience in the forest, you create resilience in the people. You stabilize people in their land. This is sometimes what I face is people don't know that. They don't know. They think of climate separate from nature. Sir David Attenborough been talking about the risk to nature, not to the climate. We're linking the two together. Finally, it dawned on them that nature and climate are linked. You need to present those risks exactly. Now, in terms of your question, there is a way from pure finance. We can always collateralize this thing. There's always a finance people who like to take early risk, but they're going to ask you, what do I get in return for coming early? Very easy. The answer is very easy, because what I'm telling you is the carbon credit is just a slice of what the future holds for us. So my pitch would be to early investors: you come in early, you provide the seed funding, and you're going to buy that carbon, let's say, at $50. But guess what? All projections say that carbon in the next year or so, my own institution says carbon ought to be $78. Private banks, I know what they're doing. They tell you the price of carbon is in the hundreds in the coming years. By the way, as we speak right now, just allow me to say this, because this is important. We have carbon cowboys traveling the world, going to certain countries that have very weak governance, buying up the asset itself. That's what I'm worried about. Those are the ones who are the brokers who understand exactly how to play that game. They're not leasing the asset as I'm talking. They're going to countries with poor governance, people that are destitute, saying, let me buy your forest. Let me buy your river. Let me buy, privatizing it, putting a fence around it, kicking out the local population. So we are in a race of time. I fully agree with you. But we have the ability to deal with this by marshaling investors who are willing to take on the risk, but you have to reward them. That's fine. Because what you're going to get with that money, you're going to everything you want. You're going to protect the land, you're going to benefit from the land, you're going to create resilience for your people. So everybody benefits. So what's wrong with that?
Right, I know we're slightly over, and I have 3 questions, I think. 1, and then there was another one, 2, and then there might have been a 3rd. Yes, the gentleman with the glasses. I'm going to draw the line at glasses. Sorry. So, yes, gentleman here in the blue.
Hi, I'm Grant Pearson. I've been trying to get myself back to Africa after having left there 30 years ago and finding investing in Zambia probably the most effective country to invest in Africa at the moment, thanks to HH. My question is, or firstly, I want to applaud Ralph for the most innovative solution I've heard to this problem. And secondly, with this doubling of population in Africa and the human encroachment, that time, as has been already said, is running out. We need more of those sorts of solutions. We can't rely on this being just a charity. Is there any other proposition on the table?
I'm not, well.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. That's why we talk about the financing gap. That is why we have a financing gap, because philanthropy has reached its limit. Proselytizing has reached its limit. Altruism has reached its limit, and we still have hundreds of billions of dollars to cover that gap. And that's why we're trying to bring in the finance world into this and saying, by the way, we're all on the Titanic together. No one is going to, the sky is, we're all under the same sky. So if the sky falls, no one's going to escape it. But what we're saying here is we can actually have a better future. But you need to engage people like me. I come from, there are a few of us here. You know, we've been ostracized for the longest time because conservation was a conversation among a select few. We were demonized, kept out. So not knowing what's going on, we finance extractive services. Now you want us to come in because we're brothers and sisters. We're all on this together, on this, right? No one is going to escape this. So you need to speak our language. You need to make a value proposition as to why do I think this is, by the way, this is not instead of altruism and philanthropy. This is on top of it. This, in addition to it, saying you will make money, but you are going to make money by saving the planet, saving your brothers and your sisters. How wonderful is that? And we can. This is not a pie in the sky. We can. That's what I'm trying to show you. Why aren't we doing it? Baffles my mind.
So I'm going to come to this person in 1 second, and then to the gentleman there. I've just come back from Panama at the CITES conference, and I'm always struck by 2 things. The first is there's no economists there. This is a World Trade Convention, and there's no economists. And the second, which is just bizarre. And then the second thing that I am always deeply disappointed by is the slow pace of change. A decision will be taken, it will be deferred for 12 months, 24 months, it'll be kicked to the standing committee, someone else will make a decision further down the track, it'll get watered down in the process. It's not unique to CITES. We need to create faster decision-making processes, and then we need to put the money in behind those decisions to implement them, because the glacial pace of change that we face now, it's like outside, very, very cold and slow.
Well, can I just add that,
yes, Tom, and then I'll come to you, Jamie.
Can I just add that besides carbon supporting conservation of nature, we're seeing a lot of opportunities now around also solar, green energy, where companies are really looking for opportunities to partner with the communities, and the communities will earn revenue from those solar energy or wind powers that will eventually also support conservation of nature and protection by, through the revenues generated from those other green energy opportunities. So we see these opportunities coming, but they all need to be structured very well. But the opportunities are really there, and we're seeing companies wanting to partner with the communities to produce nitrogen and other opportunities, and then those revenues communities earn can go towards conservation.
Thanks, Tom. And then Jamie, and one more.
Thank you. Jamie Kershid, co-founder of Nucleus, and on behalf of everyone in our company, and we'd like to thank the panelists, Will, everyone at Born Free for organizing an amazing event. A very quick question is, are all carbon credits equal? And should we start to put some quality behind the carbon credit that's being produced? And as we're a blockchain company, we love transparency, we can see where it came from, we can see how it was minted. Surely there's a way of actually allowing consumers the choice of actually choosing a carbon credit that they believe in is good for the world. So maybe that's something Ralph could answer.
May I?
Yes, yeah.
Very important question. Today, if you Google right now on your iPhone, just put EU ETS, you'll see that the price of carbon is over $100 per ton. If Africa were to come and say, would you buy my carbon? We offer them $11. Carbon is carbon. Why is it that we trade it among ourselves for $100, but Lee White in Gabon, when he wants to sell his he gets $11. So it's not about the carbon, actually. It's about the perception of the governance. We go back to the governance issue around it, the verification, the transparency, the governance aspect. So let me give it to you, because I work in this field. So let me tell you what are the issues as I see it, and what is the problem if we don't solve this issue. What I'm really advocating, we need one price. We need some entity, I'm not going to name it, to push everybody to have one price. Because if we don't have one price, here's what's going to happen. If I'm a polluter and your price of operating is $10 in one country and another is $100, where do you think I'm going to locate? I'm going to locate here and pollute the rest of the world, because pollution is a global bad, is not a private bad. You see? We cannot afford that. We need to have law of one price. That's one. Now, why don't we have one price? Let me just segue a little bit. I know two companies right now, I'm not going to name them so I don't get in trouble. They purchased a ton of carbon from a machine for $600 per ton. $600. Big companies. Now, why would they pay $600 for a ton of carbon from a machine that, how old is that machine? 2 years old, right? But they will not pay $100 from what my colleague here calls Earth Tech, a technology that is at least 3 billion years old. Why wouldn't they do that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because it has nothing to do with carbon. It has to do with what we've been talking about early on, the governance around it. Meaning, if I'm here and I want to purchase carbon from a country, so it's not the same country, from another country, I need to make sure that when I buy that carbon, are you really taking care of the asset that produces the carbon? How do I verify? So I'm Microsoft. Let's go back to the example I gave you. They're going to ask me if I say, look, why don't you invest in this country, purchase their carbon, or biodiversity, whichever you want to call it. They're going to ask me the following question. Hey, Ralph, how do I make sure that the money that I paid went to look after the elephants? You're telling me this money is to go after the elephants. How do I make sure that it's so? You're telling me that the money is going to go to the local communities, because I'm going to put it on my website. I don't want to get egg on my face. I don't want an investigative reporter to fly out from my country to that country and find out that that money went to the coffers of a corrupt politician. That's why there are differential pricing. It's not about nature. Nature is a well-vetted technology that is beyond reproach. So we need to resolve the issue of governance. You already have the solution within your company. It's the blockchain technology. It says, what are you worried about? That the money goes to look after the guardians of the elephants and the local communities and this? Well, let's enter the Put all the contracts on blockchain. That is verifiability, transparency. The next question that you have to deal with is equity. Equity, when I talk about equity, is not equity just about people, equity towards a living system called nature, and equity towards the future generations who can't vote. These are our children and our grandchildren who have a stake in this earth, just like you and me. We need to make sure that the money, that the asset, nature, is there in perpetuity. Is there a solution to it? Well, of course there's a solution. It's called a trust fund. It's called an endowment. You place the money in it under lock and key. The asset belongs to the country where that natural capital is sitting, but the flow of income from that asset is under tight governance that ensures that no matter who comes into power, who leaves power, that money is there into the future. So it's equity towards intragenerationally, intergenerationally, and towards nature in perpetuity. That's how you narrowed the prices to one.
Okay.
I'd like to add something.
Yes, please do. Timothy.
Are all carbon credits equal? The answer is no. And I'll give an example of that. If you look at carbon credit mechanisms like the one that's taking place in Kenya, you will notice that the land on which this project is taking place is actually owned by local communities. That's a good carbon credit mechanism. Then you have carbon credit mechanisms that take place on private land. That means you have to drive out communities from that land. They're not directly involved in the entire mechanism. That's not a good mechanism. Then you have management teams that run that particular project, not being transparent with the funds being raised. They'll tell you $5 million was given to the community from this mechanism, but you do not have any idea what the total amount generated was. If the total amount generated was 50 million, then 5 million doesn't look like a lot of money. But local communities are poor, so when they see the 5 million, they will be celebrating. But the mechanism is unjust. So the entire management mechanism should be transparent so that you know the total amount of money coming into this mechanism and what the exact percentage is that's ending up with the local communities. Another thing I want to mention about carbon credits. I know it's the most popular mechanism taking place right now. If you look at all the agreements that were being made at COP27, the majority of the handshakes involved carbon credit financing. Why is there so much financing going towards carbon credits and very little financing going towards loss and damage, adaptation, mitigation, and aren't those important? It's because carbon credits offer the opportunity for trade-offs. So the organizations that provide the financing for the carbon credits get an opportunity to pay this money but keep on polluting. And when they keep on polluting, they are continuing to do what brought us in this crisis anyway. So if we are truly in a climate emergency, that is also something we need to look at. Where will the financing go? Should the emphasis be on net zero carbon emission solutions, or should the emphasis be on zero carbon emission solutions? My proposal is 60% of the funding should go to zero carbon emission solutions, and 40% of the funding should go to net zero carbon solutions. Because net zero means 100 tons of carbon into the atmosphere, 100 tons out. Zero carbon emission solutions simply mean 100 tons out. If there's anything emitted in, it's not more than 100. So that's a huge plus for climate action.
Right. Gentleman there.
My name is Henry Hallwood, and I am an African, along with my fellows Tom and Timothy and many more of you in this room. And I have a very close relationship with, I'm primarily resident in Zambia, but I have a very close relationship with the Mwanya community, which is the northeast corner of the South Luangwa National Park. And my local chieftainess is Chieftainess Mwanya. And she's actually an SRN qualified nurse in the UK. Her challenge is this. She is surrounded by land that technically belongs to her people. It is a hunting concession of 500,000 acres. Traditionally, for the last sort of 30, 40 years, it's been managed largely by the National Parks Department and the Ministry of Tourism. And they tender it out to the hunters, and the hunters come along and they put their bids in. There's just been a very forward-thinking initiative by President HH, I'll come on to in a minute. But traditionally what happens is the hunters come and see the chieftainess, and promises are made, and all sorts of sort of future gifting is implied to get her signature on their concession bid. Over goes to some very powerful politicians. There's a process, and it's quite open in Zambia, actually. It's all a public process. The numbers are declared. And about 3 weeks ago, I got a spreadsheet to say that of the 28 concessions that were offered this year, they raised $10 million on the first annual rent checks. So basically, companies and hunting operators are paying somewhere between $80,000 and $200,000 a year to bring their clients and shoot the trophies. All the things we've talked about and heard eloquent things about, it's not a great long-term solution. But to Chieftainess Mwanya, it's employment for a few people. She gets 25% of the trophy fees that come to the government. Well, she doesn't really, but the principle is that she should. And that's distributed through the Community Resource Board to all the local villages. Now, the problem here, and President HH raised this point, is why not let tourism in? Why not open the concessions to tourism? Now, I thought it was a brilliant idea. I actually spent a lot of time contacting lots of conservation organizations to say, time to find the money, chaps. You guys can get behind this. Buy the hunting concessions, 7 years, say 100 and 150 grand a year, dollars. You've got it wrapped. You've just taken 500,000 acres out of hunting and into something else. All these things that you've talked about, all these opportunities. I'm afraid to say I got a very negative response from all the charities that and conservation organizations I approached. I don't know why, just no interest at all. So what can we be doing, Will? I'm asking you the question, what can you do with your organization and all the similar organizations to take advantage of this opportunity to take these hunting areas out of hunting and into other uses? It doesn't just have to be tourism. It can be lots of things. It can be all the stuff Timothy's doing. Tom, all the stuff his communities are doing can be translated into forward-thinking Zambia, very forward-thinking Zambia, and I'm hoping you've got an answer.
I have not a full answer. It is a little bit complicated because my understanding, and I'm familiar with the hunting blocks and the tendering process, is that there are a number of different fees associated. There is the fee for the hunting block, $120,000, $150,000 a year for 7 years for a primary block, $5,000 a year for 15 years for a depleted block, which means it's been shot out, there's nothing really left. On top of that, though, there is the trophy fee, and it's not from the concession fee. The concession fee goes to government, broadly speaking. The trophy fee is what gets divided between the different chiefdoms within the area. And the calculation is that you have to shoot 60% of the quota. You have to shoot 60% of the quota minimum in order for that to generate the funds that go in at community level. The problem with that is that the amount that generates, even in a primary block, I looked at one in particular, was about $98,000, of which 40% goes into the local community, in which there were two chieftain areas that were run by 2 different chiefs. That meant that was it was $46,000. That meant there were $23,000 per chieftain. And once you'd paid the community scouts the $20,000 a year that it cost to employ them, there was $3,000 left for the community. So the numbers are a little bit, and the question will be, it's not just about a wildlife charity, Born Free, others, sort of stepping into the void. It's fully understanding the implications of that, the long-term agenda that's attached to it. And I'll tell you this, if we decided at Born Free, I'm not saying we're going to do this, just because I have to be a bit careful. I've got members of the senior team here. If we went to a depleted block, and it's only $5,000 a year for 15 years, you think, well, that's $75,000 for 60,000 quid. That's not expensive. But we then spent, make it up, $100,000 a year for 15 years rebuilding that block, putting the infrastructure back in, working with local communities, bringing animals into it to get it back to some kind of sense of nature. Get to the end of the 15 years, what's going to happen? The government may then redesignate the block as a secondary block. That's now $50,000 a year, which we then may not be able to afford, and it just opens it up as an opportunity for a trophy hunting company to come in and basically benefit from all the hard work that we've put in restoring this depleted block, and they take it over as a viable concern. And it's not fiction that there are 6 hunting blocks in the current tendering round in Zambia, 6, that have changed status. There are 4 statuses: primary, secondary, under something and depleted, under stocked and depleted. Of the 6, only 1 moved in a positive direction. Only 1 in 6 moved from depleted to understocked or whatever it was. All the others were heading in a negative direction. So even with the system as it currently stands, the direction of travel, which is I'm going to conclude with in a minute, the direction of travel is negative and just shows how hard it is to turn situations around. It's not really a full answer to your question, but it will require very serious thinking by particularly smaller charities. And, you know, we're Born Free, we're not a big charity. We're not in the top 1% in this country. We're in the next bit. And so our resources are stretched very thin across policy, across education, across conservation, across rescue and care.
Can I just come back to you on
Yeah.
that? You've made a very eloquent and well thought through and very knowledgeable answer to that. And there is a fairly simple solution, and he's sitting about 2 down from you, and people like him. Now, there are many visionary tourism operators like Praveen, and I've watched Praveen over many years do what he's done. There's some large, well-funded companies like Great Plains, Wilderness, you know, Singita, all these people, they want concessions for wildlife tourism that are outside the national parks because they want the privacy and exclusivity. Yeah. And the solution to that funding issue you're talking about in the long term is to arrange for them to lease those areas as tourism concessions. Now, the numbers might not perfectly add up immediately, but that is the core opportunity in front. But it needs a catalyst. It needs a seed funder who's prepared to put, or their members or their supporters, to actually put some money on the table to just secure the land. Then, if you can't prove your point in 7 to 15 years, that you really can improve the revenue, the livelihoods, and all these things that we've heard about and Praveen's been doing for years, and the good work of Tom, you know, and Timothy's valuable and important basically soil work, if you can't make the case to keep with the community those lands as concessions that are no longer hunted as a primary source of revenue, well, maybe the hunting lobby will make their case in opposition. But it's got to be worth a go. And people like you all up there are leaders in this game, and you've got to stand up and do something.
And I agree with your last point. I think that it's going to be, we talked about having to be brave. I talked about how we're in listening mode. We're not intending to come out of this meeting this evening, this discussion this evening, with all the answers, or even some of the answers, but maybe bits of some of the answers. And what you've contributed just now, I think, is a very helpful contribution to the thinking process that we need to engage in. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been fantastic, because I've literally seen about 4 people leave, which means either you're all asleep, or you have really been engaged by this discussion. And it is a discussion. So I'm going to conclude with 3 things. The first thing is to say that this evening we've heard the most extraordinary, in my view, the most extraordinary presentations and thoughts from people who have a well of experience. And we should be privileged, we are privileged to listen to those voices, because, wow, I have learned so much just this evening. The second thing is I just want to reflect on one thing Timothy said, which I thought was really on the money, and that is the Common Agricultural Policy, don't have it here anymore, but the Common Agricultural Policy and other mechanisms encourage farming communities to support biodiversity. And why can't we have that similar approach in other parts of the world? You also mentioned soil credits, biodiversity credits. So to Ralph's point, it's not only about carbon credits. Carbon credits is the bit above the waterline right now. It's the tip of that iceberg. There's this huge block of ice underneath that we need to look at. The point that Timothy made, which got the round of applause, was it can't be just carbon credits but business as usual. So that's where, in my view, government comes in to continually squeeze on the production of pollution, so that there is a relentless drive down through legislative processes on the one hand, and there's carbon credits on the other, and other credits as well. I think governments are a bit timid, and I think governments could take a bit more risk in some of these things. I have argued for years that if we're spending £14 billion a year through our overseas development budget, would it not make sense to have just a little bit, maybe a couple of $100 million, to try lots of really innovative things? Because something will work, some won't, and we mustn't run scared of certain newspapers who will always say, oh, it's disgraceful, they're spending our money on this and it's a waste of money. We must be brave, we must try stuff, because that's the only way that we'll truly innovate. And my final thought really is two things. The first is, I've heard the words choice, opportunity, and empowerment, and justice. And I think that's exactly right. You know, this isn't this conservation, trophy hunting or not, is not the preserve of a white Western elite. Africa's wildlife, South America's wildlife, Southeast Asia's wildlife belongs to the people of those regions. And we can have robust debates about how we interface with it, what the role of the North and the West is in that. But it's theirs. I am only ever going to be a visitor. I feel, honestly, in my heart, I've spoken at meetings in Kenya. I've been to Kenya 100 times. I've spoken at meetings, and I put my hand on my heart, and I say, in my heart, I think I'm a Kenyan. But I know I'm not. I am only a visitor. But I'm a passionate visitor. I want to make a difference. I want to try and help find solutions if I can. And the last point, to bring it back to the issue that we're here talking around, trophy hunting, I think that the tide of history is moving in a particular direction. Whether it's through the trophy hunting imports prohibition bill that Henry Smith got through second reading here on the 25th of November, whether it's Germany deciding to withdraw from the CIC, or whether it's Finland, as I believe yesterday was the case, deciding that they would also introduce a trophy hunting import prohibition on species that are listed in Annex A and Annex B of the European regulation. I think it's moving in a direction. What we mustn't do is allow it to move in a direction and then fall into a void. So there's nothing there. It doesn't mean we have to have the full answer. It doesn't mean we have to have it fully funded. But to go into literally, a dead space is not going to be good for wildlife, nature, communities, conservation, all the things that you're here this evening because you care about. So this is the start. I think you're all going to be asked, if you've left us your email address, for your ideas, because this is not the sum total of knowledge by a million miles. So if you've got great ideas, or even just one start of an idea, don't be shy, share it with us, because we must move this forward together. I would like to end by asking you, please, to put your hands together for the following. So our wonderful panel, Timothy, Tom, Praveen, and Ralph, for the Royal Geographical Society, who have hosted us this evening, for my Born Free staff, who have been fantastic, for our wonderful sponsors at Nucleus, and give yourselves a round of applause as well, because you've made it all the way here.